The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to Jesus a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. Jesus took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. The beginning of a new school year. The excitement of sorting all those new things into a pencil box. Excited to burst out those colored pencils and glue sticks at craft time. The smell of that first trip into the middle school locker room, thinking, it's only been 2 weeks, how does it already smell this bad? The dread of sitting down in AP Calc, seeing that syllabus and wondering, why couldn't I just stop taking math after geometry? Even if you're not still in school, the beginning of the new school year brings all kinds of new life. Among all this other newness that happens around this time of year, I am fondly reminded of the new communities that form at the beginning of each and every school year. Communities like the one Katie Heron from the movie Mean Girls found when she moved from Africa just up the road to Evanston and started high school at North Shore High. Now, I'm not talking about the community of the plastics, the girls who are only obsessed with their looks, and got Katie to be a part of them for a while. No, the real community that Katie found was in her friends Janice, Ian, and Damien. Friends who were there for her when she wasn't for them. Friends who saw who she truly was and helped her to stick to being that person, not the fake plastic person she was trying to be. And friends who reminded her to keep looking for what was really important, friendship and community. Sometimes it really is your friends who truly know what's best for you. In our gospel lesson for today, Jesus is traveling back towards his home in Galilee after ministering up north in the region of Tyre. We don't know exactly where Jesus is at this point. The Decapolis is a pretty large region. But we can assume that he is passing through some kind of town or village on his way home. Now, as usual, as he's passing through this unnamed settlement, the crowds come out and pursue him. He's made a pretty big impact by now, and he's garnered quite the following. And now these crowds who are coming to him here are not without an agenda. They're bringing Jesus one of their own. We're told he's a man who's deaf and has a speech impediment, and he's being pushed along by the crowds who are begging Jesus to lay hands on him. Oftentimes in the Gospels, when Jesus performs a miracle, he mentions something about someone's faith. Nothing is said about this crowd's faith. We also never hear them specify what kind of healing they're looking for. This community, this group of friends is simply bringing a man with a disability to Jesus in hopes that Jesus will notice him. Now, somehow finding a way to get away from the crowds, Jesus engages with this man alone in private. And after taking care to put his hands in the man's ears and onto his tongue, Jesus looked towards the heavens and prays that a path might open. A way might open for this man to be healed. And immediately, Mark tells us, Immediately, this man begins to speak plainly, to speak for himself. Now, just minutes ago, this man was unable to verbalize his desires, his prayers. He was unable to interact fully with the world around him. And yet, he did not need to be the one to come to Jesus. His friends, his community came to Jesus on his behalf, offering up the prayers, the requests, the pleading that this man could not. We may not suffer the same physical blockage in our ears or literal stoppage of our tongues, but we may often find ourselves struggling to bring to Jesus the things we most need to lay before him. It may not be our inability to speak plainly, but something prevents us from seeking the healing we so desperately need. You may think, whatever trial it is I'm going through, it's not really that big of an issue, is it? I can handle it on my own. I can learn to cut myself off after my first drink. I can carry those extra hours at work just for another month or two. I can hide who I really am inside. Nobody, not even God, needs to know that about me. And though we may be physically capable of it, we find ourselves equally as unable to bring our needs before God as this deaf man from the gospel. Or perhaps we're more like Katie Heron than we want to admit and are unaware of just what it is we need to bring to Jesus for healing. Katie was so desperate to bring down the head of the mean girls, the queen bee, that she could not see that she was becoming exactly as fake and as manipulative as the rest of the mean girls. Do we ever find ourselves in Katie's shoes when we're walking down the halls of our high school, our office, the streets of our neighborhood? Or is it that you're so involved at work that you don't notice the needs at home that are crying out for your attention? Or is it that in attempting to get everything in that comes with being a successful family in our community, is it your prayer life, your spiritual life is the thing that slipped away from your awareness? How do you bring these needs before God if you don't even know they're there? Unable to communicate clearly for himself, it was the deaf man's friends who spoke the prayer of healing to Jesus. Unable to fully engage with the world of his time, it was his community who lifted him up and made him whole. It's important to remember and for me to note here that there is nothing lesser about someone who is deaf or tongue-tied. And anyone, no matter their condition, today can live a quite fulfilling life without the need to be healed. But in Jesus' time, this man's conditions would have been enough to ostracize him from his local community and keep him as someone who was different. But instead of ostracizing him, the community around him, his friends, came together and raised him up before God. God has put your communities around you to lift you up when you can't lift the weight by yourselves. The community was so important to the Jewish people and to the early Christian church. I think we've forgotten that as a culture, and even as the church a little bit. Depend on those communities around you. Your friends may be able to help you lift something up before God when you're not sure if you can continue lifting it by yourself. Your family may have noticed something that you need to hear them out on. This church, these people, are there to pray with you and for you and sit there with you when you don't know what the next step is. At the end of Mean Girls, Katie breaks apart the spring fleeing crown, basically the equivalent of prom queen. This crown that could have been the symbol of her new status as the new queen bee, but instead she has been taught the value of community empowering one another. And so instead of keeping that for herself, she breaks this apart and tosses pieces of the crown out into the crowd so every girl has a chance to own that title. Every girl has a chance to be empowered. She is empowering the community around her. God knows we can't lift everything on our own. In the night in which he was betrayed, in Jesus' darkest hour, yes, he needed some alone time and prayer, but he wanted to spend that time with his friends, at dinner, in the garden, in community. So as we begin another school year, look to the communities around you, at your school, in your parent group, your yoga class, your church, your brewery buddies, your neighborhood Facebook group. God speaks to us, and we speak to God through each other. When something is preventing you from seeking the healing, the encouragement, the sustenance that you need, trust your community. Let them carry it with you. And like the story with the deaf man and his community around him, your people may just speak the words you need to hear.